Mothering Sunday is always a day full of complex emotions and pastoral sensitivities. In a world where human creatures live out their imperfect human lives, making choices that are sometimes good, sometimes bad, this idea of motherhood is not immune from all of those choices that we make. They're the choices of some mothers do long-term harm to their children. And then you have mothers who are stolen from their children by violence, by war, by economic necessity, and so on and so on. Alongside all that sad human reality, there's also the reality of a world which doesn't always go the way we would have the world go. Some cannot become mothers. Others lose their children in devastating ways. And it's a really complex day, isn't it, Mothering Sunday? All of these things kind of intermingling. And many of you will be remembering mothers today with mixed emotions. There'll be some happy memories and some gratitude. There'll be plenty, I'm sure, of bitter memories and moments of pain and unhealed wounds. And yet this day is a part of the tradition of the church, and we mark it during Lent, which is a season for truth-telling, for dealing with the shadow side of our individual selves and of our society as a whole. So what does truth-telling look like this year? What does Mothering Sunday have to reveal to us about God this year? I want to suggest to you today that that story we read from Exodus 2 is a revelation of something of the motherhood of God. The story puts on display the image of God in mothers, without even mentioning that God was involved. And this story has a backstory, an introduction, found in Exodus 1, which is traumatic. That the Hebrews were an enslaved people. Their lives were at the mercy of Pharaoh, who decided one day to thin the herd of slaves. They might start getting ideas about rebelling and suddenly find that their freedom is within their grasp. And so he gives a decree that all baby males born to Hebrew women must be killed by throwing them into the Nile. And what a brutal and evil thing to command. It is an utter disregarding of human dignity and worth, and an act of evil against God and his creation. And the evil continues because Pharaoh doesn't even do the killing himself. As with dictators throughout history, he gives the dirty work for someone else to do. And even more horrifying, that dirty work is handed to the Hebrew midwives. These women who give themselves and all their wisdom and experience to trying their best to ensure safe delivery of babies, are told to check those babies, see what sex it is born, and then throw it in the Nile if it's a male. What a traumatic and evil thing to put on someone to do, to force them to do. These women were utterly vulnerable themselves, and they're now at the mercy of a man who cared nothing for their lives or the lives of their people. But it's through the vulnerability of these expendable women, their nothingness in the eyes of powerful men, that God brought about the future liberation of his people, Israel. But before we get there, there is other things we need to get through before we continue our story. And I feel like with all that's been going on in this week in particular and the week before, we need to speak some words today on Mothering Sunday of all days about violence towards women. It won't have escaped your attention, I'm sure, if you've looked at the news any time this week, of some of the horrible, shocking things that have taken place. In many ways, it started with that sensational interview. You'll know the one I'm talking about, Harry and Meghan on Oprah, and all that unleashed in response, and all that it exposed in response about the way the press and private individuals respond, in particular to Meghan as a woman, as a person. Such vile words spoken. And second, and perhaps even more devastatingly sad, that terrible news of a woman who is now named as Sarah Everard, found murdered. Murdered, they suspect, by a policeman who is currently the main suspect, about to be charged. Two among many incidents perhaps this week that we could have mentioned. And on Mothering Sunday, it would be amiss if we didn't even mention it, if we didn't say something about the sad reality of violence towards women in history and in our own current day experience. It's a structural problem, similar to racism. We have moments when it's exposed to us and the violence reaches us, and it's shown on our TV screens and in the newspapers, but it's always there. Pharaoh's attitude towards these women is just one example in history of how a male-dominated culture behaved in biblical times. And sadly, that story is often carried with the Israelites themselves as well. Women have been seen as expendable, as people who are not as valuable as others, despite playing the crucial roles, just like these midwives in the story, or like the mother and her daughter and the princess. Until we reckon with that deep-seated evil, that system that allows such violence to continue, we are perpetuating an injustice that has long and deep roots. But the story we read today, I believe, is a counter-testimony. It is a witness of how these women, from their vulnerability, made a huge impact on human history. And the story begins with an act of protest. It's the bit before we read. These midwives, 2 women in particular are named, at great risk for themselves, refuse to do what Pharaoh has ordered. They do all they can to hide the male babies. And then one day, in chapter 2 of Exodus, a certain male baby is born, who they knew was special. And for 3 months, that baby's mother kept him hidden. A woman, incidentally, who isn't named. And isn't that an interesting point? Because very few of the women in this story are given a name. The 2 midwives are named in chapter 1, but then the child's mother, the child's sister, are not named. And even the royal woman is only known as Pharaoh's daughter. A nameless group of women. But this nameless mother acts bravely for her son. She creates an ark for him, a vessel of salvation like that made by Noah, and placed him gently on the water, hiding him among the reeds. And then the child's older sister stood by, keeping watch over her brother. That was an act against the law. If discovered, they would all likelihood have been killed. And yet their bravery saved the life of that baby. And then comes another brave act, this time from one who isn't even a Hebrew woman. Pharaoh's daughter is bathing in the Nile when suddenly she sees a baby nestled in the reeds of the bank. So she orders a slave to go retrieve the package and discovers, after all, it's a baby, and it's a baby Hebrew boy. And a description of this moment, of what happens in that moment, is so moving. The text tells us this, that he was crying and she felt sorry for him. Isn't that wonderful? She would have known her father's orders, and defying them would surely be risky even for her in her privileged position. But she gives orders to go and save the child, to bring him to her own home, and prepares for him to be properly cared for. Why does she do this? Well, I think that reaction that she has to that crying baby represents the kindness and the empathy that the best of humanity is capable of. Her response to this baby overwhelms her fear, her respect for her father. And maybe also she had already despised what he had begun to do. But in her position, she had no real way of raising an objection. But here and now, God has placed in her path the opportunity to do something positive as an act of resistance to evil. And she bravely takes that opportunity. And then after her comes a Hebrew slave girl who just happens to be the child's sister. And she shows her courage when she gives advice to an Egyptian princess. That's something you wouldn't do as a slave. She's risking everything in that moment. But through her advice and through the acceptance of that by Pharaoh, this child is saved, and the child's mother is brought in to take care of him. At every step on this journey, we meet brave women who put the life of this child ahead of their own. They resisted the evil orders of a man who couldn't care less about them or the baby. And by doing all of this, they saved the life of one who was going to grow up and become a great leader for God's people, a great agent of liberation. And for our purposes today, in all that they did that time, they show us something of the motherhood of God. Because if you're looking for God in this story, although he is not mentioned by name, I think you'll find her in the way these women behave. God as mother is one who shows fierce commitment to her children, even in the face of opposition. We see that in those midwives who were brave and they refuse to commit that crime of drowning innocent children just because a man had ordered them to do so. God as mother is one who is willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of the ones she loves. We see that in the actions of Pharaoh's daughter, who risks all her privilege and safety and her comfort in order to save this child that just happened to cross her path. God as mother shows that true strength is found not in displays of power, but in doing the right thing from weakness. And we see that in the bravery of the child's sister, who goes beyond her station, risking her own safety again in order to give advice to Pharaoh's daughter, which brings about reconciliation in the family. All of these women and more in this story put on display the motherhood of God. If you put your mind to it, you see those characteristics of God echoed throughout the Bible. God tells her people she cannot ignore them or forget them, just like a mother can't forget the child at her breast. Paul speaks of Christ as one who, though equal with God, gave up that position and privilege to come alongside us in our helplessness, in our vulnerability. And we see it in Jesus, who speaks the truth to powerful men, knowing full well that that would open the door to them killing him. God is found among the vulnerable. His strength is seen most among the weak ones, the ones that the rest of the world overlooks. And so often in the Bible, as in the rest of history, these people are women who are left nameless. But their faithfulness, their resilience, their bravery is kept as a revelation in our story and is given to us as a witness to tell us something of the motherhood of God for us who have eyes to see. And there is so much we could talk about in this story, isn't there? With so much we could draw from it. We have seen already that motherhood is more than just those who give birth to a baby. It is about the care that is given to children as mothers, as carers, as family members, even as strangers. To act as a mother is to do what we can to ensure the flourishing of humanity. It is to place ourselves in harm's way. It is to live sacrificially for those who are vulnerable and marginalized. And that is something that even us men can get involved with. We must get involved with. Because God as mother isn't simply about a gender, or God as father isn't about gender. It is to be in the image of God. We must all be living in that courageous way that these women show us is possible. We must all be living fiercely passionate about protecting the vulnerable in the face of systems that chew them up and spit them out. To live sacrificially by giving up our status and our privilege that we might come alongside and serve others. To accept that in our weakness, the strength of God works to change the lives of those around us. This Mothering Sunday, with all the mixed feelings that we bring to this day, with all the threads that are pulled when we mention those words, let's go back to the witness of these women from Exodus 2. Let's see in their lives, their behaviour, the image of God. And for all of us, male or female, whatever, let's commit to following their example. And as we follow their example, we follow Jesus, who in himself is the image of God in perfection. Amen.